Chapter 39 of the Pickwick Papers, read by Patty Brugman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Chapter 39. Mr. Samuel Weller, being entrusted with the mission of love, proceeds to execute it. With what success will hereinafter appear. During the whole of next day, Sam kept Mr. Winkle steadily in sight, fully determined not to take his eyes off him for one instant until he should receive express instructions from the fountainhead. However disagreeable Sam's very close watch and great vigilance were to Mr. Winkle, he thought it better to bear with them than by any act of violent opposition to hazard being carried away by force, which Mr. Weller more than once strongly hinted was the line of conduct that a strict sense of duty prompted him to pursue. There is little reason to doubt that Sam would very speedily have quieted his scruples by bearing Mr. Winkle back to Bath, bound hand and foot, had not Mr. Pickwick's prompt attention to the note which Dowler had undertaken to deliver forestalled any such proceeding. In short, at 8 o'clock in the evening, Mr. Pickwick himself walked into the coffee-room of the Bush Tavern and told Sam with a smile, to his very great relief, that he had done quite right, and it was unnecessary for him to mount guard any longer. "I thought it better to come myself," said Mr. Pickwick, addressing Mr. Winkle as Sam disencumbered himself of his great coat and travelling shawl, "to ascertain, before I gave my consent to Sam's employment in this matter, that you are quite in earnest and serious with respect to this young lady." "Serious from the heart, my soul," returned Mr. Winkle with great energy. "Remember," said Mr. Pickwick with beaming eyes, "we met her at our excellent and hospitable friend Winkle's. It would not be an ill return to tamper lightly, and without due consideration, with this young lady's affections. I'll not allow that, sir. I'll not allow it." "I have no such intention indeed," exclaimed Mr. Winkle warmly. "I have considered the matter well for a long time, and I feel that my happiness is bound up in her." "That's what we call tying it up in a small parcel, sir," interposed Mr. Weller with an agreeable smile. Mr. Winkle looked somewhat stern at this interruption, and Mr. Pickwick angrily requested that his attendant not to jest with one of the best feelings of our nature, to which Sam replied that he wouldn't if he was aware of it, but there were so many on 'em that he had hardly knowed which was the best ones when he heard 'em mentioned. Mr. Winkle then recounted what had passed between himself and Mr. Van Allen relative to Arabella, stated that his object was to gain an interview with the young lady and make a formal disclosure of his passion, and declared his conviction, founded on certain dark hints and mutterings of the aforesaid Ben, that wherever she was at present immured, it was somewhere near the Downs, and this was his whole stock of knowledge or suspicion on the subject. With this very slight clue to guide him, it was determined that Mr. Weller should start next morning on an expedition of discovery. It was also arranged that Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Winkle, who were less confident of their powers, should parade the town meanwhile, and accidentally drop in upon Mr. Bob Sawyer in the course of the day, in the hope of seeing or hearing something of the young lady's whereabouts. Accordingly, the next morning Sam Weller issued forth upon his quest, in no way daunted by the very discouraging prospect before him, and away he walked, up one street and down another. We were going to say up one hill and down another, only it's all uphill at Clifton, without meeting with anything or anybody that tended to throw the faintest light on the matter at hand. Many were the colloquies into which Sam entered with grooms who were airing horses on roads, and nursemaids who were airing children in lanes, but nothing could Sam elicit from either the first mentioned or the last which bore the slightest reference to the object of his artfully prosecuted inquiries. There were many young ladies in a great many houses, the greater part whereof were shrewdly suspected by the male and female domestics to be deeply attached to somebody, or perfectly ready to become so if opportunity offered. But as none among these young ladies was Miss Arabella Allen, the information left Sam at exactly the old point of wisdom at which he had stood before. Sam struggled across the Downs against a good high wind, wondering whether it was always necessary to hold your hat on with both hands in that part of the country, and came to a shady by-place, about which were sprinkled several little villas of quiet and secluded appearance. Outside a stable door at the bottom of a long back lane without a thoroughfare, a groom in undress was idling about, apparently persuading himself that he was doing something with a spade and a wheelbarrow. We may remark in this place that we have scarcely ever seen a groom near a stable in his lazy moments who has not been, to a greater or lesser extent, the victim of this singular delusion. Sam thought he might as well talk to this groom as to anyone else, especially as he was very tired with walking, and there was a good large stone just opposite the wheelbarrow. So he strolled down the lane, and, seating himself upon the stone, opened a conversation with ease and freedom for which he was remarkable. "Morning, old friend," said Sam. "Afternoon, you mean," replied the groom, casting a surly look at Sam. "You're wery right, old friend," said Sam. "I do mean afternoon. And how are you?" "Why, I don't find myself much the better for seeing of you," replied the ill-tempered groom. "That's wery odd, that is," said Sam, "for you look so uncommon cheerful, and seem altogether so lively, that it does one's heart good to see you." The surly groom looked surlier still at this, and not sufficiently so to produce any effect upon Sam, who immediately inquired, with a countenance of great anxiety, whether his master's name was not Walker. "No, it ain't," said the groom. "Nor Brown, I suppose," said Sam. "No, it ain't." "Nor Wilson?" "No, nor that neither," said the groom. "Vell," said Sam, "then I'm mistaken, and he hasn't got the honour of my acquaintance, which I thought he had." "Don't wait here at a compliment to me," said Sam, as the groom wheeled in the wheelbarrow and prepared to shut the gate. "Easy for ceremony, old boy. I'll excuse you." "I'd knock your head off for half a crown," said the surly groom, bolting one half of the gate. "Couldn't afford to have it done on those terms," rejoined Sam. "It'd be worth a life's wages at least, to you, and it'd be cheap at that. Make my compliments indoors. Tell 'em not to vait dinner for me, and say they needn't mind putting by any, for it'll be cold afore I come in." In reply to this, the groom, waxing very wroth, muttered a desire to damage somebody's person, but disappeared without carrying it into execution, slamming the door angrily after him, and wholly unheeding Sam's affectionate request that he would leave him a lock of his hair before he went. Sam continued to sit on a large stone, meditating upon what was best to be done, and revolving in his mind a plan for knocking at all the doors within 5 miles of Bristol, taking them to 150 or 200 a day, and endeavouring to find Miss Arabella by that expedient, when accident all of a sudden threw in his way what he might have sat there for a 12-month, and yet not found without it. Into the lane where he had sat there opened 3 or 4 garden gates belonging to as many houses, which, though detached from each other, were only separated by their gardens. As these were large and long, and well planted with trees, the houses were not only at some distance off, but the greater part of them were nearly concealed from view. Sam was sitting with his eyes fixed upon the dust heap outside the next gate to that by which the groom had disappeared, profoundly turning over in his mind the difficulties of his present undertaking, when the gate opened, and a female servant came out into the lane to shake some bedside carpets. Sam was so very busy with his own thoughts that it is probable he would have taken no more notice of the young woman than just raising his head and remarking that she had a very neat and pretty figure, if his feelings of gallantry had not been most strongly roused by observing that she had no one to help her, and that the carpet seemed too heavy for her single strength. Mr. Weller was a gentleman of great gallantry in his own way, and he no sooner remarked this circumstance than he hastily rose from the large stone and advanced toward her. "My dear," said Sam, sliding up with an air of great respect, "you'll spoil that wery pretty figure all out of proportion if you shake them carpets by yourself. Let me help you." The young lady, who had been coyly affecting not to know that a gentleman was so near, turned round as Sam spoke. No doubt, indeed she said so afterward, to decline this offer from a perfect stranger, when instead of speaking she started back and uttered a half-suppressed scream. Sam was scarcely less staggered, for in the countenance of the well-shaped female servant he beheld the very features of his Valentine, the pretty housemaid from Mr. Nupkins. "Why, Mary, my dear," said Sam. "Like Mr. Weller," said Mary. "How did you frighten one?" Sam made no verbal answer to this complaint, nor can we precisely say what reply he did make. We merely know that after a short pause Mary said, "Lord, do, Mr. Weller," and that his hat had fallen off for a few moments before, from both of which tokens we should be disposed to infer that one kiss, or more, had passed between the parties. "Why, how did you come here?" said Mary, when the conversation to which this interruption had been offered was resumed. "Of course I came to look after you, my darling," replied Mr. Weller, for once permitting his passion to get the better of his veracity. "And how did you know I was here?" inquired Mary. "Who could have told you that I took another service at Ipswich, and that they afterwards moved all the way here? Who could have told you that, Mr. Weller?" "Ah, to be sure," said Sam, with a cunning look. "That's the point. Who could have told me?" "It wasn't Mr. Muzzle, was it?" inquired Mary. "Oh, no," replied Sam, with a solemn shake of the head. "It warn't him." "It must have been the cook," said Mary. "Of course it must," said Sam. "Well, I never heard the like of that," exclaimed Mary. "No more did I," said Sam. "But, Mary, my dear," here Sam's manner grew extremely affectionate, "Mary, my dear, I've got another affair in hand as is wery passing. There's one of my governor's friends, Mr. Winkle, you remember him?" "Him in the green coat?" said Mary. "Oh, yes, I remember him." "Well," said Sam, "he's in a horrid state of love, regularly confoozled, and done over with it." "Lord," interposed Mary. "Yes," said Sam, "but that's nothing if we could find out the young 'ooman." And here Sam, with many digressions upon the personal beauty of Mary and the unspeakable tortures he had experienced since he last saw her, gave a faithful account of Mr. Winkle's present predicament. "Well," said Mary, "I never did." "Of course not," said Sam, "and nobody never did, nor never will either. And here I'm a-walking about like the wandering Jew, a sporting character you have perhaps heerd on, Mary, my dear, as a was always doing a match again time, and never went to sleep, looking at her this year, Miss Arabella Allen." "Miss who?" said Mary, in great astonishment. "Miss Arabella Allen," said Sam. "Goodness gracious," said Mary, pointing to the garden door, which the sulky groom had locked after him. "Why, it's that very house. She's been living there these 6 weeks. The upper housemaid, which is lady's maid too, told me all about it over the washing house piling before the family was out of the bed one morning." "What, the wery next door to you?" said Sam. "The very next," replied Mary. Mr. Weller was so deeply overcome on receiving this intelligence that he found it absolutely necessary to cling to his fair informant for support, and divers little love passages had passed between them before he was sufficiently collected to return to the subject. "Well," said Sam at length, "if this don't beat cockfighting, nothing never will. As the Lord Mayor said when the Chief Secretary of State proposed his missus' health after dinner. That wery next house. Why, I've got a message to her as I've been trying all day to deliver." "Ah," said Mary, "but you can't deliver it now, because she only walks in the garden in the evening, and then only for a very little time. She never goes out without the old lady." Sam ruminated for a few moments, and finally hit upon the following plan of operations: that he should return just at dusk, the time at which Arabella invariably took her walk, and being admitted by Mary into the garden of the house to which she belonged, would contrive to scramble up the wall beneath the overhanging boughs of the large pear tree, which would effectually screen him from observation, would there deliver his message and arrange, if possible, an interview on behalf of Mr. Winkle for the ensuing evening at the same hour. Having made this arrangement with great dispatch, he assisted Mary in a long-deferred occupation of shaking the carpets. It is not half as innocent a thing as it looks, that shaking little pieces of carpet. At least there may be no great harm in the shaking, but the folding is a very insidious process. So long as the shaking lasts, and the two parties are kept the carpet's length apart, it is as innocent an amusement as can well be devised. But when the folding begins, and the distance between them gets gradually lessened from 1/2 of its former length to 1/4, and then to 1/8, and then to 1/16, and then to 1/32, if the carpet be long enough, it becomes dangerous. We do not know to a nicety how many pieces of carpet were folded in this instant, but we can venture to state that as many pieces as there were, so many times did Sam kiss the pretty housemaid. Mr. Weller regaled himself with moderation at the nearest tavern until it was nearly dusk, and then returned to the lane without the thoroughfare, having been admitted into the garden by Mary, and having received from that lady sundry admonitions concerning the safety of his limbs and neck. Sam mounted into the pear tree to wait until Arabella should come into sight. He waited so long without this anxiously expected event occurring that he began to think it was not going to take place at all, when he heard light footsteps upon the gravel, and immediately afterwards beheld Arabella walking pensively down the garden. As soon as she came nearly below the tree, Sam began, by way of gently indicating his presence, to make sundry diabolical noises, similar to those which would probably be natural to a person of middle age, who had been afflicted with a combination of inflammatory sore throat, croup, and whooping cough from his earliest infancy. Upon this the young lady cast a hurried glance toward the spot from whence the dreadful sounds proceeded, and her previous alarm being not at all diminished when she saw a man among the branches, she would most certainly have decamped and alarmed the house, had not fear fortunately deprived her of the power of moving, and caused her to sink down on a garden seat, which happened by good luck to be near at hand. "She's a-going off," soliloquized Sam in great perplexity. "What a thing it is as there, here, young creatures will go a-fainting away just when they oughtn't to. Here, young 'ooman, Miss Sawbones, Miss Winkle, don't." Whether it was the magic of Mr. Winkle's name, or the coolness of the open air, or some recollection of Mr. Weller's voice that revived Arabella, matters not. She raised her head and languidly inquired, "Who's that, and what do you want?" "Hush!" said Sam, swinging himself on to the wall, and crouching there in as small a compass as he could reduce himself to. "Only me, miss, only me." "Mr. Pickwick's servant?" said Arabella earnestly. "The wery same, miss," replied Sam. "Here's Mr. Winkle regularly sewed up with desperation, miss." "Ah!" said Arabella, drawing nearer the wall. "Ah, indeed," said Sam. "We thought we should have been obliged to straight vesket him last night. He's been a raving all day, and he says if he can't see you afore to-morrow night's over, he wishes he may be something unpleasant if he don't drown himself." "Oh, no, no, Mr. Weller," said Arabella, clasping her hands. "That's what he says, miss," replied Sam. "He's a man o' his word, and it's my opinion he'll do it, miss. He's heard all about you from the Sawbones in Barnacles." "From my brother?" said Arabella, having some faint recognition of Sam's description. "I don't rightly know which is your brother, miss," replied Sam. "Is it the dirtiest fun of the two?" "Yes, yes, Mr. Weller," returned Arabella. "Go on, make haste, pray." "Well, miss," said Sam, "he's heard all about it from him, and it's the governor's opinion that if you don't see him wery quick, the Sawbones, as we've been speaking of on, he'll get as much extra lead in his head as'll damage the weepest o' the origins if they ever been put in spirits arterwards." "Oh, what can I do to prevent these dreadful quarrels?" exclaimed Arabella.
It's a suspicion of a priori attachment, as is the cause of it all," replied Sam. "You better see him, miss." "But how? Where?" cried Arabella. "I dare not leave the house alone. My brother is so unkind, so unreasonable. I know how strange my talking thus to you must appear, Mr. Weller, but I am very, very unhappy." And here poor Arabella wept so bitterly that Sam grew chivalrous. "It may seem werry strange talking to me about these here affairs, miss," said Sam with great vehemence, "but all I can say is that I'm not only ready but willin' to do anything as'll make matters agreeable, and if chucking either o' them sawbones out the winder'll do it, I'm the man." As Sam Weller said this he tucked up his wristbands at the imminent hazard of falling off the wall, in so doing, so intimate his readiness to set to work immediately. Flattering as these professions of good feeling were, Arabella resolutely declined, most unaccountably, as Sam thought, to avail herself of them. For some time she strenuously refused to grant Mr. Winkle the interview Sam had so pathetically requested. But at length, when the conversation threatened to be interrupted by the unwelcome arrival of a third party, she hurriedly gave him to understand, with many professions of gratitude, that it was barely possible she might be in the garden an hour later next evening. Sam understood this perfectly well, and Arabella, bestowing upon him one of her sweetest smiles, tripped gracefully away, leaving Mr. Weller in a state of very great admiration of her charms, both personal and mental. Having descended in safety from the wall, and not forgotten to devote a few moments to his own particular business in the same department, Mr. Weller then made the best of his way back to the Bush, where the prolonged absence has occasioned much speculation and some alarm. "We must be careful," said Mr. Pickwick, after listening attentively to Sam's tale, "not for our own sakes, but for that of the young lady. We must be very cautious." "We?" said Mr. Winkle, with marked emphasis. Mr. Pickwick's momentary look of indignation at the tone of this remark subsided into his characteristic expression of benevolence as he replied, "We, sir. I shall accompany you." "You?" said Mr. Winkle. "I," replied Mr. Pickwick mildly. "In affording you this interview, the young lady has taken a natural, perhaps, but still a very imprudent step. If I am present at the meeting, a mutual friend, who is old enough to be the father of both parties, the voice of calumny can never be raised against her hereafter." Mr. Pickwick's eyes lightened with honest exultation at his own foresight as he spoke thus. Mr. Winkle was touched by this little trait of his delicate respect for the young protégé of his friend, and took his hand with a feeling of regard akin to veneration. "You shall go," said Mr. Winkle. "I will," said Mr. Pickwick. "Sam, have my greatcoat and shawl ready, and order a conveyance to be at the door tomorrow evening, rather earlier than is absolutely necessary, in order that we may be in good time." Mr. Weller touched his hat as an earnest of his obedience, and withdrew to make all needful preparations for the expedition. The coach was punctual to the time appointed, and Mr. Weller, after duly installing Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Winkle inside, took his seat on the box by the driver. They alighted, as had been agreed on, about a quarter of a mile from the place of rendezvous, and, desiring the coachman to await their return, proceeded the remaining distance on foot. It was at this stage of the undertaking that Mr. Pickwick, with many smiles and various other indications of great self-satisfaction, produced from one of his coat pockets a dark lantern, with which he had specially provided himself for the occasion, and the great mechanical beauty of which he proceeded to explain to Mr. Winkle as they walked along, to the no small surprise of the few stragglers they met. "I should have been the better for something of this kind in my last garden expedition at night, eh, Sam?" said Mr. Pickwick, looking good-humouredly around at his follower, who was trudging behind. "Wery nice things, if they're managed properly, sir," replied Mr. Weller. But when you don't want to be seen, I think they're more useful arter the candle's gone out than when it's lit." Mr. Pickwick appeared struck by Sam's remarks, for he put the lantern into his pocket again, and they walked on in silence. "Down here, sir," said Sam. "Let me lead the way. This is the lane, sir." Down the lane they went, and dark enough it was. Mr. Pickwick brought out the lantern once or twice as they groped their way along, and through a very brilliant little tunnel of light before them, about a foot in diameter. It was very pretty to look at, but seemed to have the effect of rendering surrounding objects rather darker than before. At length they arrived at a large stone. Here Sam recommended his master and Mr. Winkle seat themselves, while he reconnoitred and ascertained whether Mary was yet in waiting. After an absence of 5 or 10 minutes, Sam returned to say that the gate was opened and all quiet. Following him with stealthy tread, Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Winkle soon found themselves in the garden. Here everybody said "hush" a good many times, and that being done, no one seemed to have any very distinct apprehension of what was to be done next. "Is Miss Allen in the garden yet, Mary?" inquired Mr. Winkle, much agitated. "I don't know, sir," replied the pretty housemaid. "The best thing to be done, sir, will be for Mr. Weller to give you a hoist up into the tree, and perhaps Mr. Pickwick will have the goodness to see that nobody comes up the lane while I watch at the other end of the garden. Goodness gracious, what's that?" "That 'ere blessed lantern'll be the death of us all," exclaimed Sam peevishly. "Take care what you're doing on, sir. You're a sending a blaze of light right into the back parlour winder." "Dear me," said Mr. Pickwick, turning hastily aside. "I didn't mean to do that." "Now it's in the next house, sir," remonstrated Sam. "Bless my heart!" exclaimed Mr. Pickwick, turning round again. "Now it's in the stable, and they'll think the place is afire," said Sam. "Shut it up, sir, can't you?" "It's the most extraordinary lantern I ever met with in all my life," exclaimed Mr. Pickwick, greatly bewildered by the effects he had so unintentionally produced. "I never saw such a powerful reflector." "It'll be one too powerful for us if you keep a blazing away in that manner, sir," replied Sam, as Mr. Pickwick, after various unsuccessful efforts, managed to close the slide. "There's the young lady's footsteps. Now, Mr. Winkle, sir, up with you." "Stop, stop," said Mr. Pickwick. "I must speak to her first. Help me up, Sam." "Gently, sir," said Sam, planting his hand against the wall and making a platform of his back. "Step atop of that flower pot, sir. Now then, up with you." "I'm afraid I shall hurt you, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick. "Never mind me, sir," replied Sam. "Lend him a hand, Mr. Winkle, sir. Steady, steady, sir. That's the time o' day." As Sam spoke, Mr. Pickwick, by exertions almost supernatural in a gentleman of his years and weight, contrived to get upon Sam's back, and Sam gently raising himself up, and Mr. Pickwick's holding on fast by the top of the wall, while Mr. Winkle clasped him tight by the legs, they contrived by these means to bring his spectacles just above the level of the coping. "My dear," said Mr. Pickwick, looking over the wall and catching sight of Arabella on the other side. "Don't be frightened, my dear, it's only me." "Oh, pray go away, Mr. Pickwick," said Arabella. "Tell them all to go away. I am so dreadfully frightened. Dear, dear Mr. Pickwick, don't stop there. You'll fall down and kill yourself. I know you will." "Now, pray don't alarm yourself, my dear," said Mr. Pickwick soothingly. "There is not the slightest cause for fear, I assure you." "Stand firm, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, looking down. "All right, sir," replied Mr. Weller. "Don't be longer than you can conveniently help, sir. You're rather heavy." "Only another moment, Sam," replied Mr. Pickwick. "I merely wished you to know, my dear, that I should not have allowed my young friend to see you in this clandestine way if the situation in which you are placed had left him any alternative. And lest the impropriety of this step should cause you any uneasiness, my love, it may be a satisfaction to you to know that I am present. That's all, my dear." "Indeed, Mr. Pickwick, I am very much obliged to you for your kindness and consideration," replied Arabella, drying her tears with her handkerchief. She would probably have said much more had not Mr. Pickwick's head disappeared with great swiftness in consequence of a false step on Sam's shoulder, which brought him suddenly to the ground. He was up again in an instant, however, and bidding Mr. Winkle make haste and get the interview over, ran out into the lane to keep watch with all the courage and ardour of youth. Mr. Winkle himself, by the occasion, was on the wall in a moment, merely pausing to request Sam to be careful of his master. "I'll take care of him, sir," replied Sam. "Leave him to me." "Where is he? What is he doing, Sam?" inquired Mr. Winkle. "Bless his old gaiters," rejoined Sam, looking out at the garden door. "He's a keeping guard in the lane with that 'ere dark lantern, like a amiable Guy Fawkes. I never see such a fine creature in my days. Blest if I don't think his heart must have been born 25 year after his body at least." Mr. Winkle stayed not to hear the encomium upon his friend. He had dropped from the wall, thrown himself at Arabella's feet, and by this time was pleading the sincerity of his passion with an eloquence worthy even of Mr. Pickwick himself. While these things were going on in the open air, an elderly gentleman of scientific attainments was seated in his library, 2 or 3 houses off, writing a philosophical treatise, and ever and anon moistening his clay and his labours with a glass of claret from a venerable-looking bottle which stood by his side. In the agonies of composition, the elderly gentleman looked sometimes at the carpet, sometimes at the ceiling, and sometimes at the wall. And when neither carpet, ceiling, nor wall afforded a requisite degree of inspiration, he looked out of the window. In one of these pauses of invention, the scientific gentleman was gazing abstractly on the thick darkness outside, when he was very much surprised by observing a most brilliant light glide through the air at a short distance above the ground, and almost instantaneously vanish. After a short time the phenomenon was repeated, not once or twice, but several times. At last the scientific gentleman, laying down his pen, began to consider at what natural causes these appearances were to be assigned. They were not meteors, they were too low. They were not glowworms, they were too high. They were not will-o'-the-wisps, they were not fireflies, they were not fireworks. What could they be? Some extraordinary and wonderful phenomenon of nature which no philosopher had ever seen before. Something which it had been reserved for him alone to discover, and which he should immortalize his name by chronicling for the benefit of posterity. Full of this idea, the scientific gentleman seized his pen again, and committed to paper sundry notes of these unparalleled appearances, with the date, hour, minute, and precise second at which they were visible, all of which were to form the data of the voluminous treatise of great research and deep learning, which should astonish all the atmospherical sages that ever drew breath in any part of the civilized globe. He threw himself back in his easy chair, wrapped in contemplations of his future greatness. The mysterious light appeared more brilliantly than before, dancing, to all appearances, up and down the lane, crossing from side to side, and moving in an orbit as eccentric as comets themselves. The scientific gentleman was a bachelor. He had no wife to call in and astonish, so he rang the bell for his servant. "Pruffle," said the scientific gentleman, "there is something very extraordinary in the air tonight." "Did you see that?" said the scientific gentleman, pointing out of the window as the light became visible. "Yes, I did, sir." "What do you think of it, Pruffle?" "Think of it, sir?" "Yes, you have been bred up in this country. What should you say was the cause of those lights now?" The scientific gentleman, smiling, anticipated Pruffle's reply that he could assign no cause for them at all. Pruffle meditated. "I should say, sir, it was thieves," said Pruffle at length. "You're a fool, and may go downstairs," said the scientific gentleman. "Thank you, sir," said Pruffle, and down he went. But the scientific gentleman could not rest under the idea of the ingenious treatise that he had projected being lost to the world, which must inevitably be the case if the speculation of the ingenious Mr. Pruffle were not stifled in its birth. He put on his hat and walked quickly down the garden, determined to investigate the matter to the very bottom. Now, shortly before the scientific gentleman walked out into the garden, Mr. Pickwick had run down the lane as fast as he could to convey a false alarm that somebody was coming that way, occasionally drawing back the slide of the dark lantern to keep himself from the ditch. The alarm was no sooner given than Mr. Winkle scrambled back over the wall, and Arabella ran into the house. The garden gate was shut, and the three adventurers were making the best of their way down the lane, when they were startled by the scientific gentleman unlocking his garden gate. "Hold hard," whispered Sam, who was, of course, the first of the party. "Show a light for just 1 second, sir." Mr. Pickwick did as he was desired, and Sam, seeing a man's head peeping out very cautiously within half a yard of his own, gave it a gentle tap with his clenched fist, which knocked it, with a hollow sound, against the gate. Having performed this feat with great suddenness and dexterity, Mr. Weller caught Mr. Pickwick up on his back and followed Mr. Winkle down the lane at the pace which, considering the burden he carried, was perfectly astonishing. "Have you got your wind back again, sir?" inquired Sam, when they had reached the end. Quite now," replied Mr. Pickwick. "Then come along, sir," said Sam, setting his master on his feet again. "Come between us, sir. Not half a mile to run. Think you're a winning a cup, sir. Now for it." Thus encouraged, Mr. Pickwick made the very best use of his legs. It may be confidently stated that a pair of black gaiters never got over the ground in better style than those of Mr. Pickwick on this memorable occasion. The coach was waiting, the horses were fresh, the roads were good, and the driver was willing. The whole party arrived in safety at the Bush before Mr. Pickwick had recovered his breath. "In with you at once, sir," said Sam, as he helped his master out. "Don't stop a second in the street after that 'ere exercise. Beg your pardon, sir," continued Sam, touching his hat as Mr. Winkle descended. "Hope there weren't a prior attachment, sir." Mr. Winkle grasped his humble friend by the hand and whispered in his ear, "It's all right, Sam, quite right." Upon which Mr. Weller struck 3 distinct blows upon his nose in token of intelligence, smiled, winked, and proceeded to put the steps up with the countenance expressive of lively satisfaction. As to the scientific gentleman, he demonstrated in a masterly treatise that these wonderful lights were the effect of electricity, which clearly proved the same by detailing how a flash of fire danced before his eyes when he put his head out of the gate, and how he received a shock which stunned him for a quarter of an hour afterwards, which demonstration delighted all the scientific associations beyond measure, and caused him to be considered a light of science ever afterward. End of chapter 39.